Before the camera was raised, the real photograph had already been created on paper. Names were arranged, positions were debated, and one place beside the king became the most dangerous square in the room. What began as protocol quickly became a vote on Camilla's royal future. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, because this royal mystery is only beginning, and the decision made inside that room would expose a struggle the palace could not easily hide. The photograph had not been planned by one person. Communications staff studied how the image would be received. Senior courtiers considered rank and tradition. Private secretaries examined every possible political meaning, while members of the royal household worried about the message each position would send. Nothing was casual. Every name carried weight, and every empty space could become a warning. In the first version, Camilla stood beside the king. It was the obvious arrangement. She was his wife, his queen, and the person expected to represent unity at his side. To Charles, the position reflected the life he had fought to protect. To Camilla, it confirmed that years of criticism and humiliation had finally led to acceptance. Then the objections began. Several advisors warned that placing Camilla too prominently might pull attention away from the purpose of the event. They feared that her position would reopen public memories the palace had spent years trying to control. Diana's name was not written into the plan, yet her presence seemed to hover over the discussion. Every argument about Camilla eventually returned to the same old wound. But the debate soon moved beyond public opinion. One senior figure allegedly argued that the photograph should represent inherited continuity, not marital position. That changed everything. Camilla's title gave her senior rank, but rank was not the same as blood. William, Catherine, and their children represented the future of the crown. Camilla represented Charles's reign, and some inside the palace believed those two meanings should never be allowed to compete. William's representatives reportedly resisted any arrangement that placed Camilla between the king and the direct line of succession. They did not openly demand her removal. Their objections were quieter, more careful, and therefore more powerful. They spoke of balance, history, and public trust. Yet beneath those polite phrases was a hard message. Camilla could stand beside Charles, but she could not stand in the way of what came after him. Charles understood the danger. He wanted to defend her, but he also knew that another public dispute could weaken the monarchy. The institution was asking him to choose between the woman he had protected for decades and the future he was expected to preserve. Camilla learned of the argument before the event. Her response was cold and direct. She would not stand in a place where her presence was being treated as a problem. That refusal created an uncertainty the palace could not explain. Was she removed, or did she step away before they could remove her? Then staff discovered two approved versions of the lineup. One placed Camilla beside the king. The other had erased her name completely. But the existence of two competing plans raised a more troubling question. Who had the authority to choose the final version, and why was the decision made only moments before the royal family entered the room? Minutes before the photograph, staff were told the arrangement had changed. No public announcement was made. No full explanation was offered. Camilla's position disappeared from the lineup, and those closest to the decision were warned not to discuss who had issued the final command. The change came so late that several aides first believed there had been a mistake. They had rehearsed the original order, checked the spacing, confirmed each name, and prepared the family to enter without hesitation. Then, a revised formation arrived. It contained one fewer senior royal. Camilla's place beside Charles was gone. Confusion spread quickly, but quietly. No one could afford to let the tension become visible. Staff began shifting positions, adjusting the order, and passing instructions in low voices. Every movement had to appear natural, even though nothing about the decision felt natural. The palace was trying to erase a queen from the arrangement without allowing the room to understand what had happened. Camilla was informed in private that the photograph would continue without her. The exact words used in that conversation were later disputed. Some claimed she was told the image had been narrowed for constitutional reasons. Others said she was simply asked to wait elsewhere. But the meaning was unmistakable. She had prepared to stand beside her husband, only to be removed moments before taking her place. That timing turned a protocol dispute into a personal humiliation. 3 possible sources of the order immediately emerged. Charles may have approved it under pressure. A senior courtier may have acted in his name. Or the change may have been a compromise forced by competing royal households determined to protect the direct line of succession. Each possibility carried its own betrayal, yet none could explain why Charles remained silent. For Camilla, that silence hurt more than the missing position. Charles did not openly object. He did not stop the process. He allowed the institution to move forward, and in that moment, she saw the old pattern return. Their marriage could be defended in private, celebrated in speeches, and displayed when convenient. But when the crown felt threatened, she could still be pushed aside. William remained outwardly controlled. He did not challenge the revised arrangement, and he later insisted that he had never demanded Camilla's removal. Yet his calm acceptance only deepened suspicion. He did not need to issue the order if the palace already understood what future he represented. When Camilla confronted a senior courtier, the answer was brutally simple. The decision, she was told, was about continuity, not affection. In one sentence, the palace exposed its true hierarchy. Love could shape a marriage. It could not rewrite bloodline. There was one problem. Before the final change, a photographer had already captured a test image with Camilla beside Charles. The discarded version now existed as proof of the arrangement the palace had abandoned. Staff were immediately instructed to classify every unused photograph as private working material and prevent it from circulating. The palace might have contained the discarded image, but it could not contain the public reaction and when questions began multiplying. Officials offered an explanation that contradicted the event's own guest list. The palace claimed Camilla had been excluded because the photograph followed a narrow official theme. Yet names, schedules, and eyewitness accounts told a different story. The more officials tried to explain the image, the clearer it became that they were hiding the decision, not clarifying it. The first statement sounded careful. Officials described the photograph as a formal image limited to royals carrying out a specific constitutional or ceremonial role. On the surface, the explanation appeared neat. It gave the public a rule, and rules were supposed to make the absence seem harmless. But the details did not survive close attention. At least one person included in the final arrangement held no greater official role in the event than Camilla. That single fact weakened the palace's defense. If the image was truly restricted by duty, why had the rule been applied to her, but not to everyone else? Then, earlier briefing notes began circulating. In those documents, the photograph had reportedly been called a family portrait. That description changed the meaning completely. A family portrait did not require a constitutional test. It required presence, relationship, and belonging. Camilla was the king's wife. Leaving her out now looked less like protocol and more like rejection. Journalists quickly found another problem. Camilla appeared in other photographs taken during the same occasion. She had not been ill. She had not arrived late. She had not missed the event. She was there, close enough to be included, yet absent from the one image chosen to carry the greatest weight. Under growing pressure, a second explanation appeared. This time, palace sources suggested that Camilla had chosen not to take part. But witnesses remembered something different. They claimed she had been directed away shortly before the final lineup was formed. That suggestion angered Camilla. It made her seem weak, uncertain, or unwilling to stand beside Charles. Worse, it protected whoever had actually removed her. Her silence was being used as proof of consent. Tension grew between the king's communications team and Camilla's private staff. One side spoke of tradition and careful planning. The other hinted that the decision had been forced upon her. Trusted reporters began receiving different versions of the same event, and each new explanation made the palace appear less certain. Then, another detail emerged. The official caption attached to the image had been changed shortly before publication. Earlier wording had reportedly emphasized family unity. The final version used colder language, broad enough to hide why the Queen was missing. Charles was urged not to respond personally. Advisors warned that any direct defense of Camilla would turn suspicion into open conflict and expose disagreement within his own household. His silence protected the crown, but it left his wife standing alone. By then, the omission was no longer a minor argument over protocol. It raised a deeper fear. Was the palace quietly reducing Camilla's importance while Charles was still on the throne? The answer seemed to arrive in a leaked message from a senior courtier. The photograph had been described privately as the succession photograph. If the picture was really designed around succession, then Camilla had not been left out by accident. She had been removed from a visual statement about what would remain after Charles was gone. The phrase succession photograph changed the meaning of everything. This was no longer about one ceremony or one awkward decision. It was a portrait of the monarchy beyond Charles, and in that future, Camilla had been deliberately erased before her husband's reign was even over. Official royal photographs are never just records of a moment. They can act as quiet declarations of power, showing the public who matters now and who is expected to matter later. Every position carries meaning. Every absence can become a message. In this image, Charles was linked directly to William and the next generation, creating a clear line from the present crown to the future one. Camilla, however, had no place in that story. For her, the truth was devastating. Her authority came from Charles. Her title, household, influence, and access to royal power existed because he was king. The photograph forced her to face what the palace had never said openly. When his reign ended, much of her world could end with it. That fear reached far beyond public appearances. Camilla began to wonder whether her staff would be reduced, whether her residences would remain available, and whether her public duties would quietly disappear. Even the jewels she wore could be recalled. What looked like royal security was suddenly revealed as something temporary, controlled by rules she had never fully owned. William's position made the situation even colder. He did not need to attack Camilla or publicly shame her. He only had to refuse to promise that her current status would survive his accession. Behind closed doors, discussions had reportedly already begun about which ceremonial privileges she might keep after Charles's death and which would return to the sovereign. Those talks touched everything. Residences linked to the crown, staff paid through royal funds, private archives containing sensitive family history, collections of art and jewelry associated with the monarch rather than the individual wearing them. Camilla may have used these things, lived among them, and built her public identity around them, but use was not ownership. Then, the most personal issue emerged. Several jewels worn by Camilla were already under review. Officials wanted to know which pieces were private gifts, which belonged to the royal collection, and which would have to be returned when William became king. The question was not simply legal. It was emotional. Some pieces carried memories of earlier royal women, and some were still deeply connected in the public mind to Diana. The photograph now felt like a warning without words. Camilla was queen, but she was not blood. She stood beside the crown, yet she could never become part of the line the palace was determined to preserve. Charles understood what this meant, and guilt began to close around him. He had spent years forcing the institution to accept Camilla, only to realize it might erase her the moment he was no longer able to protect her. Camilla responded by demanding a private inventory of every jewel, residence, title, staff position, and privilege she could lose under a new reign. That inventory uncovered something far more dangerous than a future reduction in status, a disputed collection of jewels linked to Diana, Camilla, and the next monarch's authority to reclaim them. Behind the missing photograph lay a second conflict the palace had kept buried. Several jewels worn by Camilla were never fully hers. Some were tied to the crown, others were linked to Diana, and one private request from William threatened to strip Camilla of more than precious stones. The inventory Camilla ordered was meant to bring certainty. Instead, it exposed how little control she truly had. Records were divided between private gifts, royal loans, family inheritances, and pieces whose ownership had never been clearly settled. Some had been given to her by Charles, others belonged to the sovereign's collection and could be recalled. A few carried such powerful links to earlier royal women that possession alone could never silence the past. One necklace became the center of the dispute. It had been connected in the public mind to Diana, not because the records were simple, but because memory had made it hers. Every time Camilla wore it, the piece carried two stories at once: the authority of the present queen and the pain of the woman who came before her. William reportedly believed certain jewels should eventually pass directly to Catherine. In his view, their meaning belonged to the next Princess of Wales and the future queen, not to someone whose influence would end with Charles's reign. He did not frame it as punishment. He called it continuity. But to Camilla, the message was unmistakable. Surrendering the jewels might appear respectful. It might calm the palace and soften public anger. Yet, it would also confirm the fear the photograph had already created: that her position was temporary, her privileges conditional, and her place beside the crown dependent on one man's protection. Then Camilla learned of an unwritten rule. Jewels carrying strong dynastic meaning could be recalled without a public explanation, even from the queen consort. The wearer might command attention, but the institution still controlled the box, the records, and the final decision. That rule became dangerous on the day of the photograph. Camilla had planned to wear the disputed necklace. Senior advisors feared it would dominate the headlines and turn a carefully managed royal image into another painful comparison between Camilla and Diana. Shortly before the event, she was quietly asked to choose another piece. She refused. To Camilla, the request was not about taste. It was a test of obedience. Removing the necklace would show that the palace could still control how she appeared and which parts of royal history she was allowed to claim. She had already endured years of being told when to wait, when to remain silent, and when to accept less. This time, she would not yield. That refusal may have sealed her fate. Rather than force the queen to remove the jewel, the palace found a colder solution. They removed her from the photograph. But the humiliation did not end there. After the event, the necklace was no longer in Camilla's private dressing collection. No transfer form had been signed. No official notice had been delivered. The case remained, but the jewel inside it was gone. The missing jewel proved that the palace had gone beyond controlling an image. Someone had entered Camilla's private collection, removed a royal object, and left no official record explaining where it had been taken. Camilla had endured public hatred, private suspicion, and decades of comparison. But the vanished jewel and the missing photograph crossed a final line. For the first time since becoming queen, she stopped cooperating, and the palace realized she knew enough to cause permanent damage. Her confrontation with Charles was not calm. She demanded to know whether he had approved the change to the photograph and whether he had allowed the disputed jewel to be removed. Charles did not give her the answer she wanted. He insisted that he had not directly ordered either action. Yet he admitted that advisors had warned him against resisting. Challenging the decision, they claimed, could trigger a wider battle with William, senior officials, and the households already preparing for the next reign. That hesitation became its own confession. Camilla did not believe Charles had personally planned her humiliation. What wounded her was something more familiar. Once again, he had chosen peace with the institution over a public defense of her. He had allowed others to decide what their marriage could survive, then expected her to accept the damage in silence. This time, she refused. Several upcoming engagements were suddenly placed under review. Camilla told her staff to stop coordinating directly with the Central Palace communications team. Messages went unanswered. Briefing documents were returned. A quiet rebellion began inside the royal household, and every missed call made the tension harder to hide. Then came the threat the palace feared most. Camilla considered releasing her own statement, making it clear that she had not chosen to step away from the photograph. One sentence from her could destroy the official explanation and prove that the Queen had been removed against her wishes. She also possessed leverage. There were private letters, internal household records, discussions about Diana's jewels, and evidence of how palace advisors had shaped public stories to protect the crown. Camilla had spent years learning where the monarchy hid its contradictions. Now, for the first time, she appeared willing to use that knowledge. Senior courtiers rushed to negotiate. They offered restored appearances, private guarantees, and control over selected jewels. In return, they wanted silence. William refused to join those talks. To him, the threat of disclosure looked like emotional blackmail. His refusal widened the divide between the king's wife and the man who would one day control her future. Catherine quietly tried to calm the conflict. She was not defending Camilla. She was protecting the monarchy from another public family war and from the return of wounds connected to Diana that had never fully healed. Camilla's final demand was the hardest. She wanted Charles to correct the palace's false explanation himself, even if it exposed disagreement within the family. After resisting, he agreed to a compromise. But before the statement could be prepared, officials discovered that the unreleased test photograph showing Camilla beside Charles had already been sent outside the royal household. Once the hidden photograph escaped palace control, the family could no longer argue over whether the truth should be revealed. The only question was who had leaked it, and what else they were preparing to release. The unreleased image proved Camilla had originally stood beside the king. It showed the first arrangement, the contested jewel, and faces far less united than the official portrait suggested. But the photograph's most explosive detail was not Camilla's presence, it was the reaction of the future king. Once the image reached people outside the royal household, the palace's explanations began to collapse. Camilla was clearly standing beside Charles in the position first assigned to her. She had not arrived late. She had not chosen to remain elsewhere. She had been prepared to appear in the photograph before someone ordered the arrangement to change. The disputed necklace was also visible. That single detail connected the photograph to the private battle over royal jewels, inheritance, and Diana's memory. What the palace had described as a simple matter of protocol now appeared to be the final act of a much deeper confrontation. Yet attention soon shifted toward William. His expression appeared controlled, but his distance from Camilla suggested tension. Those who studied the image believed a private exchange had taken place shortly before the order changed. The palace refused to explain what had been said, allowing suspicion to grow around the future king's role. William continued to deny that he had demanded Camilla's removal. He maintained that decisions about official photographs belonged to senior staff. But the leaked image raised a harder question. Even if he had not issued the command, had the palace acted because it already understood what he wanted? The source of the leak created another shock. Officials initially suspected someone from Camilla's private team. Instead, the image had reportedly been released by a long-serving palace employee who believed the public had been deliberately misled. Attached to the file was an internal note containing the phrase the household feared most, future continuity problem. Camilla's presence had not merely created an awkward comparison, it had been judged a threat to the message of succession. Charles finally approved a revised statement admitting that the photograph had changed because of institutional considerations. It was cautious language, but it confirmed that the decision had been deliberate. For Camilla, the victory felt empty. The truth had emerged, but so had the palace's view of her. She was queen while Charles lived and reigned, yet the institution was already deciding how much of her position would survive him. The missing necklace was later traced to a protected royal vault, where it had been placed until ownership could be formally settled. No apology accompanied its return to royal control. The palace simply treated the jewel as something it had always possessed. Then, another secret surfaced. A second unreleased photograph existed, taken after Camilla had been removed. It reportedly showed Charles turning away from the official arrangement and speaking privately to her while the family waited. No one knew whether he was comforting her, blaming her, or making a promise William would never be required to honor. And until that final photograph is released, the palace will continue insisting the matter was procedural. Even though every hidden image tells the same story, Camilla was not forgotten. She was deliberately removed. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel for more hidden royal stories, secret palace conflicts, and mysteries the monarchy would rather keep behind closed doors.